law enforcement agencies saying they're on high alert amidst threats of a so-called national shutdown tomorrow. SABC Communications Head Major General Matabelo Peter says in a statement that Nat Joins is aware of inflammatory messages on various social media platforms advocating for violence, but warns those behind the messages that inciting violence is a criminal offence. To talk a little bit more about this is Dr. Guy Lamb. He is a criminologist at the University of Stellenbosch. He joins us now. Very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Let me first ask if you've taken note of some of these posters or sound bites through social media that are doing the rounds, and do you have any idea if they pose what police may see as a threat, a serious threat?
I mean, what do we know this so far is that, Nat Joins, so national government, or sort of the security cluster, has put out this media statement. It's aware of these social media posts, these posters that have been distributed, but largely on social media. Obviously, they kind of are overly cautious these days, given what happened back in July, especially in KwaZulu-Natal and parts of Gauteng, that they want to make the public aware that there may be something going on here. But of course, circulating this kind of information is nothing new in South Africa. It happens fairly regularly. In many cases, it doesn't go anywhere. In some cases, it's quite localized. So we've seen quite a bit of this around xenophobic violence, where we've seen calls for action against foreign nationals or foreign nationals in specific sectors such as spaza shops. But, sometimes it leads to violence, but often it doesn't, because it needs people to perpetrate that violence. So you've got individuals who may or may not be in certain communities that are calling for this, but it ultimately comes down. The threat is only really going to be realized if people are willing to perpetrate that violence.
So let's just, examine what we mean here by threat. What is considered criminally inflammatory messages vis-a-vis freedom of expression? This was brought up during the unrest. Some people questioning the difference between the two and what the fine line is.
Well, freedom of expression is you can express your opposition to government, you can express your opposition to a particular political party, you can express your opposition to maybe legislation or policy that's in place. But when you're encouraging and actively inciting people to go and burn something, to use violence against others, to restrict other people's rights, I think that's when you start getting into really dangerous ground. And I think it's quite clear, as we saw during July, where you had quite prominent individuals that were encouraging others to go and loot. And that is a criminal offense to do that. And I think that's the nature of some of these messages that have now come out. It's been encouraging people to use violence to shut something down, to shut streets down, to shut communities down, to engage in violence against specific targets, whether it be government, whether it be particular installations, and that is particularly criminal offense.
So we've also seen people saying that, expressing a disparate viewpoint is not necessarily advocating for violence and is not necessarily spreading divisive messaging. And I want you to talk us through this, because people are also quite inventive with words. So etymology, the differences in vernacular, for instance, and what is understood in a language that is not your own, have also been brought up, saying that you actually misunderstood when I say this. It's not necessarily calling for action. It is an expression in terms.
Well, I think it really comes down to if that particular call, this particular terminology, or the kind of messaging that's put out there is, you get clear cases where it's irrespective of whether it's your first, second, third language. If you say, go and burn this particular place, or come to the streets and we need to target the specific population, I think that's quite clear. I think where it comes into the use of violence, we're getting into the territory of kind of structural violence, which is to say, well, we're being repressed violently by the state, therefore we need to use violence against the state. In those kind of cases, that might be viewed as kind of a sense of opposition. But when you're specifically saying that you need to use violence targeting a specific area and targeting specific people, then you're into the territory of kind of committing a criminal offense.
Let's look at preparedness from a policing or safety and even intelligence point of view. The role of community police forums related to sub-forums to mobilize communities against any form of lawlessness. obviously it wouldn't be tactile to tell us exactly what they're going to do, but what does on high alert really mean for law-abiding citizens who actually do want to believe that Nat Jones is taking these threats seriously?
I think it's the kind of issue here is they've kind of concerned, given what happened last time they were in specific communities. So we're talking about what happened in July, where communities where police were unaware in specific communities that, you know, groups were going to perpetrate looting, were going to perpetrate unrest, and didn't necessarily have the intelligence. So they're sort of already reaching out, I think, with this sort of messaging to say to communities where there's risk of this kind of violence happening is, please, can you just sort of find out and try and ascertain if violence is going to happen, but also see if you can kind of calm the situation, or if you are aware of anything that's going to go down in your specific community, please do approach the police, please do approach government to kind of engage with them on this to see if this kind of, if this violence can be prevented or kind of reduced if it does break out.
So how would that then influence what you consider as key areas for enough deployment, whenever that is, and what would be the command organization around that?
Well, I mean, it all comes down to what is the intelligence saying. So I think with the sort of messaging around there is if, you know, community police forums are coming forward and saying, look, there are certain groups within this policing area that we're responsible for that seem to be organizing and mobilizing for some form of action, and then obviously for them to report that to their local police station, and then the police would then forward that sort of information through to the relevant structures. So it would either be the prov joints at the provincial level, which would then feed it up to the NAT joints. So that would be usually the mechanism, or for members of the public to call the police. There are helplines that people can call. So that's what I think the police are doing here, is that they've kind of been, well, Nat Joints is aware, but working through the police is aware that things are happening, but they would like the community to give them more information.
And speaking of community, I have to ask this very last question. There are people in the past we saw were standing up in defense of their communities which they considered under attack, who ended up themselves being arrested. What do you say to members of the community in differentiating not being involved in criminal activity and also cooperating with law enforcement in helping defend communities?
Well, it's essentially the role, or what is the role of the Community Police Forum? The role of the Community Police Forum is to be the sort of problem-solving forum for the community that facilitates an engagement between the police and residents. It's supposed to be a democratic representative organization. So when it functions well, it builds a good relationship with the police. If the police are functioning well, they build a good relationship with that. And then they can find ways of deploying members to provide adequate protection or patrolling of their community. What we saw in a few communities during the period in July, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal and particularly around Phoenix, seemed to have been this breakdown in the relationship between communities and police. And as a result, the communities were there policing their communities themselves, and you saw certain individuals who were more prone to violence taking responsibility for that patrolling and going above and beyond the law and perpetrating acts of violence.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your thoughts around this matter. Dr. Guy Lamb, criminology expert at the University of Stellenbosch.